I will not take anything from you. I cannot. One would think you were a queen as well as being one of the real d'Urbervilles. Well, Tess dear, I suppose I'm a bad sort of man. I've always been one, and I always will be one. But I promise I won't be bad to you again. And if anything should happen, you understand? If you are in any trouble or need anything, just drop me a line and I'll send by return whatever you want. She stepped down from the carriage and was going to leave him when he stopped her and said, "You're not going to turn away from me like that, dear. Come, let me kiss you." "If you wish," she answered coldly. She offered her cool cheek to him, but her eyes rested on a distant tree, as if the kiss had nothing to do with her. "You don't give me your lips, Tess. I'm afraid you'll never love me." "It's true. I have never loved you, and I never can." She added sadly, "Perhaps I should tell a lie, and then I could lead a comfortable life. But I have enough honour not to tell that lie. If I loved you, I might have a very good reason to tell you so. But I don't." Alec sighed heavily, as if the scene were depressing him. "Well, you're very sad, Tess, and you have no reason to be. You're still the prettiest girl for miles around. Will you come back with me? Say you will." "Never, never. I've made up my mind and I won't come." "Then goodbye." And Alec jumped up into his carriage and drove off. Tess did not watch him go, but continued her walk alone. It was still early in the day, and the sun was not yet giving any warmth. Tess felt even sadder than the autumn sadness which surrounded her. But soon a man came up behind her, a man with a pot of red paint in his hand. "Good morning," he said, and offered to carry her basket. "You're up early on a Sunday?" he continued. "Yes," said Tess. "A day of rest for most people, although I do more real work today than in the rest of the week put together." "Do you?" "In the week I work for man, but on Sunday I work for God. That's better work, don't you think? Wait a moment. I have something to do here." He stopped at a gate, and in large red letters on the middle bar of the gate he painted some words from the Bible. "Punishment awaits you." In the soft air, against the gentle green of the trees and the peaceful fields, these great red words stared at Tess. They pointed a finger at her. This man was a stranger and could not know her story, but the words accused her. "Do you believe what you paint?" she asked in a low voice. "Do I believe those words? Do I believe I am alive?" "But," she whispered, trembling, "suppose you were forced to do wrong?" He shook his head. "I can't answer that question. I paint the words and leave others to think about them in their own hearts." "I think they're horrible words," cried Tess. "I'll take my basket and go now." And she walked away from him, her heart beating fast. "I don't believe God said those things," she thought as she reached her village. There was smoke coming from her father's chimney, but seeing the inside of the cottage made her heart ache. It was as poor as ever. Her mother jumped up, surprised to see her. "Well, my dear Tess," she said, kissing her, "how are you? Have you come home to be married?" "No, not for that, Mother." "What? Isn't your cousin going to marry you?" "He's not my cousin, and he's not going to marry me." Her mother looked at her closely. "Come, you haven't told me everything." Then Tess went up to her mother, put her head on Joan's shoulder, and told her the whole story. "And you haven't persuaded him to marry you?" cried Joan. "What's the good of going there? Why didn't you think of doing some good for your family, instead of thinking only of yourself?" Tess was confused. Alec had never mentioned marriage to her, But even if he had, she would never have accepted him, because she did not love him. This made her hate herself for what she had done. She would certainly never love him in the future. She did not quite hate him, but did not wish to marry him, even to remain respectable. "You ought to have been more careful if you didn't want to marry him." "Oh, Mother!" cried the poor girl, her heart breaking. "Why didn't you warn me about men? I was a child when I left home. I didn't know how dangerous they can be, and you didn't tell me." "Well, we must make the best of it," said her mother. "It's only human nature, after all." That afternoon, the little cottage was full of Tess's friends, girls who lived in the village and who had missed her while she had been away. They whispered to each other that Tess was sure to marry that handsome gentleman. Fortunately, Tess did not hear them. She joined in their laughing and talking, and for a short time almost forgot her shame. But the next day was Monday, the beginning of the working week, when there were no best clothes and no visitors. She awoke with the innocent children asleep around her, she who had lost her innocence. She looked into her future and grew very depressed. She knew she had to travel on a long, stony road, without help or sympathy. She had nothing to look forward to, and she wanted to die. In the next few weeks, however, she became more cheerful, and went to church one Sunday morning. She loved listening to the well-known tunes, and gave herself up to the beauty of the music. She wondered at the composer's power. From the grave he could make a girl like her, who had never known him, feel extremes of emotion. She sat in a quiet, dark corner listening to the service. But when the village people arrived at church, they noticed her and started whispering to each other. She knew what they were saying, and realized she could come to church no more. So she spent almost all her time in her bedroom, which she shared with the children. From here she watched the wind, the snow, the rain, beautiful sunsets and full moons, one after another. People began to think she had gone away. She only went out after dark to walk in the woods and the fields. She was not afraid of the dark or the shadows. It was people she was anxious to avoid. She was at home on the lonely hills, but she felt guilty surrounded by innocent nature. When it rained, she thought nature was crying at her weakness. And when the midnight wind blew, she thought nature was angry with her. But she did not realize that although she had broken an accepted social rule, she had done nothing against nature. She was as innocent as the sleeping birds in the trees or the small field animals in the hedges. Chapter 7. One day in August, the sun was rising through the mist. In a yellow cornfield near Marlott village, it shone on 2 large arms of painted wood. These, with 2 others below, formed the turning cross of the reaping machine. It was ready for today's harvest. A group of men and a group of women came down the road at sunrise. As they walked along, their heads were in the sun, while their feet were in the shadow of the hedge. They went into the field. Soon there came a sound like the love-making of the grasshopper. The machine had begun, and 3 horses pulled it slowly along the field. Its arms turned bright in the sunlight. Gradually the area of standing corn was reduced. So was the living space of the small field animals, who crowded together, not knowing that they could not escape the machine in the end. The harvesters followed the machine, picking and tying up bundles of corn. The girls were perhaps more interesting to look at. They wore large cotton hats to keep off the sun, and gloves to protect their hands from the corn. The prettiest was the one in the pale pink jacket, who never looked around her as she worked. She moved forward, bending and tying like a machine. Occasionally she stood up to rest. Then her face could be seen, a lovely young face, with deep dark eyes, and long, heavy curling hair. Her cheeks were paler, her teeth more regular, and her red lips thinner than most country girls. It was Tess Durbeyfield, or d'Urberville, rather changed, living as a stranger in her home village. She had decided to do outdoor work and earn a little money in the harvest. The work continued all morning, and Tess began to glance towards the hill. At 11 o'clock, a group of children came over the hill. Tess blushed a little, but still did not pause in her work. The eldest child carried in her arms a baby in long clothes. Another brought some lunch. The harvesters stopped work, sat down and started to eat and drink. Tess also sat down, some way from the others. She called the girl, her sister, and took the baby from her. Unfastening her dress and still blushing, she began feeding her child. The men kindly turned away, some of them beginning to smoke. All the other women started to talk and rearrange their hair. When the baby had finished, Tess played with him without showing much enthusiasm. Then suddenly she kissed him again and again, as if she could not stop. The baby cried out at the violence of her kisses. "She loves that child, though she says she hates him and wishes they were both dead," said one of the women, watching the young mother. "She'll soon stop saying that," replied another. "She'll get used to it. It happens to lots of girls." "Well, it wasn't her fault. She was forced into it that night in the chase. People heard her sobbing. A certain gentleman might have been punished if somebody had passed by and seen them. It was a pity it happened to her, the prettiest in the village. But that's how it happens. The ugly ones are as safe as houses, aren't they, Jenny?" And the speaker turned to one who was certainly not beautiful. Tess sat there unaware of their conversation. Her mouth was like a flower, and her eyes were large and soft, sometimes black, blue, or grey, sometimes all three colours together. She had spent months regretting her experience and crying over it, but suddenly decided that the past was the past. In a few years her shame and she herself would be forgotten. Meanwhile the trees were just as green, and the sun shone just as brightly as before. Life went on. She most feared what people thought of her, and imagined that they talked constantly about her behind her back. In fact, she was not often discussed, and even her friends only thought about her occasionally. Other things of more importance took up their time. If there had been no people around her, Tess would not have made herself so unhappy. She would have accepted the situation as it was. She was miserable, not because she felt unhappy, but because she imagined herself rejected by society. Now she wanted to be useful again and to work. So she dressed neatly and helped in the harvest and looked people calmly in the face, even when holding her baby in her arms. Having eaten her lunch quickly, Tess went back to work with the harvesters in the cornfield until it was dark. They all came home on one of the largest wagons, singing and laughing together. But when Tess reached home, she discovered that the baby had fallen ill that afternoon. He was so small and weak that illness was to be expected, but this still came as a shock to Tess. She forgot the shame surrounding his birth and only wished passionately to keep him alive. However, it became clear that he was dying. Now Tess had a greater problem. Her baby had not been baptized. Her ideas on religion were not very developed. She had more or less accepted that she would go to hell for her crime, and did not much care what would happen to her after death. But for her baby it was different. He was dying and must be saved from hell. It was nearly bedtime, but she rushed downstairs and asked if she could send for the parson. Her father had just returned from the public house, and was at his most sensitive to the shame brought upon his noble name by Tess. He refused to allow the parson in and locked the door. The family went to sleep. As the night passed, Tess realized in great misery that the baby was close to death. She walked feverishly up and down the room until an idea came to her. Perhaps baby can be saved. Perhaps it will be just the same. She lit a candle and woke her young brothers and sisters. Having poured some water into a bowl, she made them kneel around, with their hands together as in church. The children were hardly awake and watched Tess with big round eyes. She looked tall in her long white nightdress, her long dark hair hanging down her back to her waist. Her enthusiasm lit up her face, giving it a beautiful purity, the face which had caused her shame. She picked up the baby. One of the children asked, "Are you really going to baptize him, Tess? What's his name going to be?" She had not thought of that, but remembered the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible. Because they did wrong together, God said they would live in sorrow for the rest of their lives. She said firmly, "Sorrow, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." She splashed some water on the child, and there was silence. "Say amen, children." "Amen," they replied. Tess put her hand into the water and drew a huge cross upon the baby with her finger. She continued the service in the well-known words, asking for the baby to be protected against the world and against wickedness. Her belief gave her hope. Her sweet, warm voice rang out the thanks that follow the baptism. The single candle was reflected in her shining eyes like a diamond. The children asked no more questions, but looked up at her in amazement. She seemed almost like a god to them. Poor Sorrow's fight against the world and wickedness was a short one, fortunately, perhaps, taking into account his situation. In the blue light of the morning he breathed his last. Tess had been calm since the baptism, and she remained calm. She was no longer worried about Sorrow's afterlife. If God did not accept the baptism, she did not value his heaven, either for herself or for her child. Tess thought a good deal about the baptism, however, and wondered if it might mean that Sorrow could be buried in the churchyard, with a church service. She went to the parson's house after dark and met him near his gate. "I should like to ask you something, sir. My baby was very ill, and I wanted you to baptize him, but my father refused to allow it. So I baptized him myself. Now, sir, can you tell me this?" And she looked him straight in the eyes. "Will it be just the same for him, as if you had baptized him?" The parson wanted to say no. She had done what should have been his job. But the girl's strong feeling impressed him. The man and the parson fought inside him, and the man won. "My dear girl," he said, "it will be just the same." "Then will you bury him in the churchyard?" she asked quickly. The parson felt trapped. It was a difficult question to answer. "Ah, that's a different matter," he said. "I'm sorry. I cannot." "Oh, sir?" She took his hand as she spoke. He took it away, shaking his head. "Then I'll never come to church again," she cried. "But perhaps it will be the same for him. Tell me, have pity on me, poor me. Tell me what you really think." The parson was deeply touched by her emotion. For a surprising moment, he forgot the strict rules of his church. "It will be just the same," he answered kindly. So the baby was carried in a cheap wooden box to the churchyard at night. There is a corner of the churchyard where the grass grows long, and where the suicides, drunks, unbaptized babies, and other supposed criminals are laid. Sorrow was buried here, at the cost of a shilling and a pint of beer for the gravedigger. Tess bravely made a little cross and put it at the head of the grave one evening, when she could enter the churchyard without being seen. It is all very well saying that we learn from experience. Tess had certainly learnt from experience, but could not see how to use her knowledge, so painfully gained. So she stayed in her parents' home during the winter, helping to look after the children, making clothes for them and earning a little money whenever she could. Important dates came round again. The night of her shame and the chase, the baby's birth and death, her own birthday. One day, when she was looking at her pretty face in the mirror, she thought of another date, even more important, her own death. When it came, it would swallow up all her prettiness and everything that had happened to her. When was it? It was a day lying hidden among all the other days of the year, so that she noticed nothing when it came round, and did not know what week, month, season, or year it would be. In a flash, Tess changed from simple girl to complicated woman. Her face was often thoughtful, and there was sometimes a tragic note in her voice. Her eyes grew larger and more expressive. She became a beautiful woman. She had suffered, but had gained a certain self-confidence from her experiences. Although the village people had almost forgotten her trouble, she decided she could never be really happy in Marlott. Trying to claim relationship with the rich d'Urbervilles seemed so foolish and shameful to her. She thought her family would never be respected there again. Even now she felt hope rise within her, hope of finding a place with no family connections and no memories. In escaping from Marlott, she intended to destroy the past. Perhaps now she could make up for her crime against society. Consequently, she looked hard for work away from Marlott. She finally heard that a dairyman, some miles to the south, needed a good milkmaid for the summer. Having decided to go there, she promised herself there would be no more hopeless dreams. She would simply be the dairymaid Tess, and nothing more. Even her mother no longer talked about their connection with the noble d'Urbervilles. But in spite of Tess's decision to forget her ancestors, the dairy, called Talbothays, especially attracted her, because it was near the former lands of the old d'Urberville family. She would be able to look at them, and not only observe that the noble d'Urberville family had lost its greatness, but also remember that a poor descendant had lost her innocence. She wondered if some good might come of being in the land of her ancestors. Hope and youthful energy rose up in her again, like leaves on a young tree in spring. A New Life. Chapter 8. And so it was that on a beautiful morning in May, 2 to 3 years after her return from Trantridge, Tess Durbeyfield left home for the second time. She was going in the opposite direction this time. When she reached the first hill, she looked back at Marlott and her father's house with sadness in her heart. She travelled partly by carriage and partly on foot, carrying her basket. Not far to her left she could see the trees which surrounded Kingsbere, with its church where her ancestors lay in their tombs. She could no longer admire or respect them. She almost hated them for ruining her life. Nothing of theirs was left except the old seal and spoon. "Huh, I have as much of mother as father in me," she said. "All my prettiness comes from her, and she was only a dairymaid." Her walk took 2 hours, until she reached the hill overlooking the valley of the great dairies. This valley was watered by the river Froom, and produced huge amounts of milk and butter, more even than Tess's Vale of Blackmoor, which was known as the Vale of Little Dairies. As she stood and looked, she realized the valleys were quite different. Here the fields and farms were much larger. She saw more cows at a glance than she had ever seen before. The evening sun shone on their red, white, and brown bodies. She thought that this view was perhaps not as beautiful as the view of Blackmoor Vale, which she knew so well. There the sky was deep blue. The smell of the earth was heavy in the air. The streams ran slowly and silently. But this view was more cheerful. Here the air was clear and light, and the River Froom rushed as fast as the shadow of a cloud. Either the change in the quality of the air, or the feeling that she was going to start a new life here, made her feel much happier. She ran along, her hopes and the sunshine warming her. She looked at her best as she ran, laughing into the warm wind. The desire for pleasure, which is in every living thing, had finally won over Tess. She was, after all, only a young woman of 20, who had not finished growing up. No event, however unpleasant, could have marked her forever. She was young and strong and beautiful, and could not remain sad for long. Her hopes rose higher than ever. She wanted to show how grateful she was for this second chance. She started singing love songs, but found they were not enough to express her feelings. She remembered the Sunday mornings of her girlhood and sang, "O sun and moon, O stars, O children of men, praise the Lord, praise him forever," until she stopped suddenly and murmured, "But perhaps I don't quite know the Lord yet." This was probably a pagan feeling in a religious form. People who live in the country and are close to nature, like Tess, keep many of the pagan ideas of their ancestors in their souls. Religion learned in church comes much later and does not touch them deeply. Tess was happy to be making her way independently in life. She really wanted to live honestly and work hard, unlike her father. Tess had her mother's energy and the energy of her youth to help her recover from her experience. Women do usually live through such experiences. Where there's life, there's hope, is still true for most betrayed women. As Tess, full of enthusiasm, came downhill towards the dairy, she suddenly heard the milking call again and again from all parts of the valley. It was 4:30 when the dairy people brought in the cows. Tess followed the red and white animals, with their great bags of milk under them, into the farmyard. She saw the long sheds and the wooden posts shining and smooth where the cows had rubbed against them over the years. She saw the cows between the posts, the sun throwing their shadows on the wall as carefully as a painter paints a beautiful king or queen. As the cows waited for their turn, the milk fell in drops on the ground. The dairymaids and men had come from their cottages as they saw the cows arriving from the fields. Each girl sat on her three-legged stool as she milked, her right cheek resting on the cow's body, watching Tess arrive. The men milked with their hats low over their eyes and did not see her. One of them was a middle-aged man, the head dairyman she was looking for. He worked 6 days a week in his white milking clothes, milking and butter-making, and on the 7th he wore his best suit to take his family proudly to church. Because of this, people nearby used to say, "Dairyman Dick, all the week. On Sundays, Mr. Richard Crick." Most dairymen are usually bad-tempered at milking time, but Mr. Crick was glad to get a new dairymaid at this busy time of the year. So he received Tess warmly and asked her how her family were. "When I was a boy, I knew your part of the country very well," he said. "An old woman of 90, she's dead now, but she used to live near here. She once told me there was an ancient noble family of a name like yours who came from here originally, but I didn't take any notice of an old woman like that." "Oh, no, that's just a story," said Tess. Then Mr. Crick turned to business. "You can milk well, my girl. I don't want my cows drying up, especially just now." "Oh, yes, I can," answered Tess. He looked at her delicate hands and pale face. "Quite sure you're strong enough for this sort of life? It's comfortable enough here for rough country people, but it's hard work." "Oh, yes, I'm strong enough. I'm used to hard work," Tess insisted. "Well, have some tea and something to eat. You've had a long journey," he said kindly. "No, I'd rather begin milking straight away," said Tess. "I'll just drink a little milk first." This surprised Dairyman Crick, who appeared never to have thought of milk as a drink. "Oh, if you can swallow it, have some," he said, holding the bucket for her to drink from. "I haven't touched any for years. It would lie in my stomach like a stone, so it would. Now, try that one and see how you get on." And he pointed to the nearest cow. As soon as Tess was on her stool under the cow, and the milk was pouring between her fingers into the bucket, she really felt that her new life was beginning. As she relaxed, she looked around her. It was a large dairy. There were nearly 100 milking cows. Dairyman Crick milked 6 or 8 of the difficult ones with his own hands. He could not trust them to the dairymaids, because if the cows were badly milked, their milk would simply dry up. For a while, there was no more talk among the milkers. Suddenly, Mr. Crick got up from his stool. "We're not getting as much milk from them as usual," he said. "We better sing them a song, friends. That's the only thing to do." So the group of milkers started singing, to encourage the cows to give more. Mr. Crick went on, "But I think bulls like music better than cows. Did I tell you all about William Dewey? On his way home after a wedding, he found himself in a field with an angry bull. He took his violin and played some Christmas church music, and down went the bull on his knees, just like the animals around baby Jesus, and so William was able to escape." It's a curious story. Takes us back to the past, when belief in God was a living thing. This unusual remark came from under a cow. "Well, it's quite true, sir, believe it or not. I knew the man well," said Mr. Crick. "Oh, yes, I'm sure it's true," said the man behind the brown cow. Tess could not see his face, and could not understand why the head dairyman himself should call him sir. The man stayed under the cow long enough to milk 3, at times saying something angrily to himself. Then he stood up, stretching his arms. Tess could now see him clearly. He wore the clothes of a dairyman, but underneath he was quite different. He looked educated and gentlemanly. But now she realized that she had seen him before. He was one of the 3 walking brothers who had stopped their walk to admire the May Day dance in Marlott a few years before. He had danced with some of the other girls, but not with her. He had not noticed her, and had gone on his way. For a moment she was worried that if he recognized her, he might discover her story. But she soon saw he did not remember her at all. Since she had seen him in Marlott, his face had grown more thoughtful. He now had a young man's moustache and beard. From the time he had spent milking 1 cow, he was clearly a beginner at dairy work. Tess discovered that only 2 or 3 of the dairymaids slept in the house besides herself. They all shared a big bedroom near the cheese room. That night one of the girls insisted on telling Tess about all the people at the dairy. To Tess, half asleep, the whispers seemed to be floating in the air. "Mr. Angel Clare. He's the one who's learning milking. He's a parson's son and thinks a lot and doesn't notice girls. His father is parson at Emminster, some way from here. His sons, except Mr. Clare, are going to be parsons too." Tess gradually fell asleep. Chapter 9. Neither Angel Clare nor his family had originally chosen farming as a profession for him. When he was a boy, people admired his great qualities. Now he was a man, something vague and undecided in his look showed that he had no particular purpose in life. He was the youngest son of a poor parson. One day when he was studying at home, his father discovered that Angel had ordered a book of philosophy, which questioned the church's teaching. How could his son become a priest if he read such books? Angel explained that he did not in fact wish to enter the church like his brothers, because the church's views were too strict and did not allow free thinking. The simple parson was shocked. He was a man of fixed ideas and a firm believer. And if Angel did not want to become a priest, what was the use of sending him to study at Cambridge? For the parson, the whole point of going to university was to become a minister of God. "I want to use my mind," Angel insisted. "I want to read philosophy. I want to question my belief, so that what is left after I have questioned it will be even stronger." "But, Angel, your mother and I have saved and saved to send you to university like your brothers. But how can we send you there if it is not in the service of God?" So Angel did not have the advantage of a university education. After some years studying at home, he decided to learn farming. He thought this kind of work could give him what he most valued, independence and freedom to think. So he came to Talbot at 26 as a student. At first he stayed up in his room most of the time in the evenings, reading and playing his harp. But he soon preferred to read human nature by taking his meals in the general dining room with the dairy people. The longer he stayed, the more Clare liked living with these simple country people. No longer did he see them as lacking in intelligence. He realized they were no different from him. He and they were all people walking on the dusty road which ends in death. He began to like working outside. He was learning about nature and about life. He came to know the changing seasons, morning and evening, different winds, waters and mists, shade and silence, and the voices of nature. All this he had never known before. For several days after Tess's arrival, Clare, sitting reading a book, hardly noticed she was there. But one morning at breakfast, he was reading music and listening to the tune in his head, when he heard a musical voice which seemed to become part of his tune. He looked round at Tess, seated at the table. "What a fresh and pure daughter of nature that dairymaid is," thought Angel. He seemed to remember something about her, something which took him back into a happy past, before decision made his life difficult. This memory made him look more often at Tess than the other dairymaids. Chapter 10. Dairyman Crick insisted that all the dairy people should milk different cows every day, not just their favourites. He was worried that a dairymaid might leave the dairy, and then her cows would not like being milked by a stranger. However, Tess began to find that the cows which came to her usually happened to be her favourites. This made her milking much easier, but she soon realised that it was not by chance, as it was Angel Clare who sent the cows in for milking. "Mr. Clare, you have sent me my favourite cows," she accused him one morning, blushing. "Well, it doesn't matter," said he. "You will always be here to milk them." "Do you think so? I hope I shall, but I don't know." Afterwards she was angry with herself. She had spoken too seriously to him, as if he were involved in her staying or leaving. In the evening, after milking, she walked in the garden alone, thinking about it. It was a typical summer evening in June. The air was delicate, and there was a complete, absolute silence. It was broken by the sound of a harp. The notes floated in the still air, strong and clear. Tess listened like a fascinated bird. She drew near to Clare, who still had not seen her. She was conscious of neither time nor space. The tune moved through her mind and body, bringing tears to her eyes. The waves of colour of the wild flowers mixed with the waves of sound.